So, as said before, Claudia's world is for me very foreign, but very interesting. And I was really thinking of how these two approaches, what are their similarities and what are their differences. And I think what I was really also impressed when talking with Claudia on the phone, that she says, for her, there's no difference between nature and artificial resources, but rather how can we use any resources for the better of us. And I think this is where the similarities actually start. And so one of my first questions is, how do you see, I start a little bit differently, because with the practical examples you built, Claudia, with the installations you made and exhibited in the public squares, what were the reactions of the public?
Well, there are multiple reactions, which is also something I try to document there. In general, kids love it. Some biologists can deal with it, some biologists hate it. But especially for me, and that's the reason why I started the second group of projects that try to expand this at the urban scale. For me, it becomes more interesting when the project goes beyond the aspect of discussing a problem and create an interaction with the problem, which is more permanent. And this question of interaction that for me is really important. You mentioned the fact that I said there is I don't see difference between city and landscape, or I don't see a clear difference between the natural and the artificial. This is because as human beings we are embedded in a system, and we are, in my opinion, part of this system. And the question is, and many of the elements I also mentioned that we consider natural are in reality completely changed by human interaction. So it's difficult to say. I come from the Alps, I told you, and many say, oh, the Alps are natural. Well, to a certain extent, they are made of organic and inorganic matter, but they've been actually shaped by human interaction quite heavily. And there are examples of landscape that have been changed even more. So for me, the question is, how can you push as much as possible design to create interaction with the issue of production? So you shift the attention from really solving the problem to working within the problem. Or I really like a quote from Donna Haraway that say, stay with the trouble. So work from within rather than from above. And that's what our prototype tried to do. And that's why I started to initiate a second level of project that try to do that in a more permanent manner. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Anna, I think I really like what you said, Claudia, stay with the trouble. Yes. Would you also agree on that aspect, and how would you see it in your project?
Yes, I like that too. Yeah, usually it's always the, when for example, when we did the bamboo, or when we tried to make the bamboo structure in the medical school, we did mock-ups here, and we had nice bamboo imported from Colombia, and it all worked out well. And then we came to the site, and it was much too thin. It was absolutely curvy, and we thought, my God, how should we work with this? And all the structural calculation didn't fit anymore. And then we stayed with it, with the trouble, of course, and we said, well, this is the material we have, and we're gonna stick with it. And when we made then again a mock-up, and we actually used the trouble that we had, the curved bamboo, we used it as a potential. We built it in a kind of bridge, how you say it, in a curved way, in an arch, yes. And then we made the maximum load on top, and then it was even. So, you know, things don't go the way you want all the time, but when you really stick with it and say, okay. And the thing is, when you have limited resources, which I do, when I'm working, I have mainly 2 materials, then you create the solutions out of these materials, which is, I think, a fascinating level of creativity, because what I felt before, I was composing, you know, I was looking in the internet for new materials and trying to compose them together. This is a different creativity. And when I did my own home, I started to do it. And then when I got really frustrated, I thought it's much more interesting really to invent the things out of what you have. And it's a different approach, but I would agree. I also like to stick with it. And I think that's what we usually do when we come to a problem, which try to change the material often. It's, for example, your concept, a great structural engineer also said that he sees that in architects. Once they come to a certain limitation and problem, they try to change the material. And this is something I can't do when I have limited resources.
But is not this the way material are presented to us in Western society? Is not the problem the way the material are presented, not the abundance of material? I make an example. They talk about material in a way, but more about recycling. I grew up in a farm, and in the north of Italy, and my grandma would recycle the whole day. She wouldn't call it recycle. She would call it making sense of her life. Because she would read the process around there, so she would be able to reprocess matter. But the way we recycle nowadays in our house, to me, looks like an indulgencia. I don't know if you know what the indulgencia was. In the medieval time, you could give 1,000 lira to the Pope, and it will keep you a place in paradise, whatever you do. Nowadays, you put the apple in the brown bag, the plastic in the orange one, all the rest in the green, or whatever the color coding is. But there is no way of reading the process. We are in a society that is framed by object rather than interaction with matter. And that's the problem of how we interact with food, energy, and with the material of architecture itself. We have the possibility to choose something on a shelf. We have no possibility to interact with the process of how it's done. And that's why, for me, it becomes interesting on the movement of the Fab Lab, of the robotics. That it looks like a techie things, but in reality, it exposes much more of the process. And for me, it talks about the possibility of a shift where we are not anymore consumer of object, but we are interacting with a certain amount of process that surround us, and we can read. Of course, we are not in the static world of my grandma anymore. We are in a world which is much more dynamic. But how can we, through virtual and physical reality, regain this capability of read pattern that are also material, not simply social and economical, that are the ones that we read in current society, and therefore be creative with that as society. And that's, for me, is a shift that is interesting, because it's not only that we have abundance, but it's also that the material is framed conceptually, I think, in a different manner.
I think that describes this very well, and I think this is where you are very similar in your way of thinking, that you want to involve non-architects, I would say, non-scientists, in the process, to make the process visible and to make people become part of the process. I think that is one very important aspect you two have in common, and that's why I thought when learning more about you, I really thought that is so interesting, because the appearance of your projects are so different, but the thinking of it has a common ground. So, coming to common ground, I would like to ask, let's say, a practical question. How do you get these projects, let's say Anna first, out of the ground, and then to Claudia, on the ground? I mean, how do they become reality? How do you receive a project? How do you get a new contract to do something? And what do you see as your future, Claudia? Can you make it more common, let's say, so that people understand what is going on and accept it. Anna first.
Yeah, the first project, well, the design was part of my diploma, so the design was anyway for free, but for the construction costs, I was practically going from door to door and doing this carol singers campaign, so I was singing to get the construction materials. I don't have to do that now anymore, luckily, but it's still a lot of fundraising is involved, so it's like initiating the projects happens still a lot. So but meanwhile I also get the phone calls, would you like to do this, which is good, but I prefer to initiate a project. I usually don't do competitions because that's also a lot of wasted time very often. So instead of doing this, I take the time and do the designs for charity project and try to get the funds in. Then that makes more sense to me, because then I know that the philosophy is completely in the way I want, and the partners are in the same line. And of course now I also have good partners in NGOs that really also thinking in that way and support and they say, well, we want to build a school, and they know it's important. In the beginning, it was difficult, because that time when I started, why do you need beauty in development? It was something seen as a luxury. And nowadays, I think it's changing, and it's seen that beauty is actually there's a need for that, and even the poorest communities, they need this because it has to do with dignity. So that it's changing, it's getting easier, but at the beginning, it's a lot of effort in it, but it's worth it. And I saw that when you do something that really is, comes from within, and people will join your team, and it's something you do together, and then it will develop. And it's usually easier when you do it in teams.
Claudia, how do you get your projects on the ground from the installations?
Well, we should have seen the second part of the presentation, but I'll try to describe it now, what's the plan or the struggle. So the question is, the project of, I don't want to do a skyscraper. In this, there is a difference. And at least, well, you can always change mind, but I don't want to do a skyscraper, or in the sense I say it now because the end of the project of the algae, we have other to come, but as I said, became a product on itself, and many sees it as a facade or as, on a skyscraper and etc. But I don't see it like this, and for me, the next level of project is to try and understand how these become urban and infrastructural landscapes. So we started to deal with a set of projects. We did one in Montenegro and one now in Tallinn as part of the Biennale, that use, the one in Montenegro was presented in Venice, that use art or curatorial experience to deal with projects, these sites that are complex. So sites that, for example, have a conflict between post-industrial infrastructure or current industrial infrastructure and ecological park. And that's the way I'm trying to deal and get more concrete. And in the project in Montenegro, through our intervention, they got money from the European Union. The site became protected, so they now need to go to a second step, and I'm trying to do the same in Estonia. Of course, it's very difficult because for me, my projects are on the ground. The problem is that the rest of the world doesn't see it like that. So the question, why I'm saying that, is that when we approached the project in Montenegro, and there was a problem of an ornithological park and a Saudi Arabian development, a developer from Saudi Arabia that wanted to completely erase the local ecology. The ecologists that wanted to preserve the local ecology, but ecology you cannot preserve it, especially if it's a post-industrial site or a former salina that in order to survive it needs pump. So that's not about preserving ecology. Ecology is dynamic. But what we often propose, as I said, is a way of interacting with the problem. So an interface, a set of smaller interaction. And that is always often seen as utopic. While for me, it's much utopic to say, as I said before, we clean all the air, we preserve the ecology. Sorry, how do you preserve an ecology? It's an impossibility. You are saying something that might seem very reassuring to everybody, but it simply cannot work. So it's a struggle because there are project that goes on, and for me are on the ground, but is how do you, for me it's more how the project is seen than what the project is, because for me it's on the ground. And it's really how you see it, how you see smaller step as part of a larger infrastructure without the necessity of having the plan or do a skyscraper, which in certain cases might be good to have, but not all the time. So, and in many cases it's not. And that's the point. And I think this point comes often from this, again, battle between the landscape and the architecture, and from the fact that we are used to identify the architecture with the building. Architecture, if it's an interface between human being and the surrounding environment, maybe it's not only about the building. When architecture was defined as such, as a discipline, sorry, I always speak too much, but when architecture was defined as a discipline in the Renaissance, we were in a totally different kind of condition of relationship between human being and surrounding environment. The surrounding environment of the biosphere, if you wish, was much stronger than the urban sphere. In the condition in which we are now, maybe we don't need fortress, maybe we don't need to frame nature, we need a way of enabling this dialogue.
Claudia, you also mentioned in the phone call we had that you try to change the way politicians think with your projects. Are you then in contact specifically with politicians, or is it more a general thing? So when I think about the Biennale in Tallinn, how did the politicians react to your project?
That's what I was discussing now, and that's why I work in small country. It's easier to reach politicians. No, that's a coincidence, but actually it's true. Because in places like Montenegro or Estonia, you know, the community is much smaller, and it's easier to establish relationships. So in the Biennale in Tallinn, we had on board the Ministry of the Environment as well, the city architect, and we are thinking to, in that case, the project was about the wastewater treatment plant of planning, which is again in the same site of an ornithological park, and the city want to make it more urban. But the question of the politician that I was mentioning is that still often politicians are used to think in this paradigm of problem solving, and this is how you discuss design as a way of changing this paradigm, and that's what I'm trying to do, and that's why I think also the structure of the office of the architect needs to become more polycephalum, in a way of having multiple capability to tackle this type of discourse.
Anna, how are you able to change politicians' views with your projects? Have you experienced this during your projects? And how is it in Bangladesh compared to Europe?
Politicians, this is always, I mean, what I'm trying always to put in is that I want to have a carbon tax. It's something really, it's incredible that, you know, we did the test in Austria to build in the most easiest way, where large parts of the human populations are building the houses, like taking the wet clay and just shaping it by hand, like this one office building, and the interior we did like this. It's almost unpayable. And if we just cast it in concrete and you know, with all these 3D plotter things, that would be doable. So, but these computers and you know, no one is paying our pension fees, while people, of course, when we hire craftsmen, that supports our social system. So how can our economic system not support a way of building that is good for the people, for the society and the planet? I don't understand. It's something that makes me very angry. This is something I want to change, and I'm putting it as public as often as I can. And I hope one day I will succeed. I mean, at least I have the climate on my side, but it still feels like David against Goliath, especially if, you know, the cement lobby is extremely strong, but I'm also talking to them. I don't know if I change anything, but I keep doing it. But I can't say if it's really changing something.
But I think, again, the problem doesn't lie in the robot itself, or in the machine, or in the computer, but the problem lies in how it's seen. Because in the moment we invented a tool to work with clay was high-tech, right? Because it was invented, was not there before, was high technology. The problem, I think, with the technology that we have nowadays is how it's seen. Is the human eyes is not distributed, is centralized. And the problem is the centralization, is not the technology itself, because in the moment you have a relationship with a tool, the tool becomes more human, and you're able to craft through the tool, being that a tool which is a robot, or being that a tool which is a knife, or being that a tool that is a brush. It doesn't matter. It's a tool and can become a technique. And it can become a technique which is very human and distributed and doesn't need to be run by a big corporation. The problem that we have nowadays is that robots and certain type of technology are controlled completely from the top down, in my opinion. In fact, when I see this article that comes out and say, oh, robots are gonna take our place, and no, they're never gonna take our place. A robot is never going to be me. It's always going to be something else. But how do we deal with this something else? How do we make this something else more human? How do we make it more distributed? How can it be useful or not useful? That's the question. It's not the question that, you know, something is outside or of going back to other tool. I'm completely open to tool. I can use the pencil, I can use the robot, I can use the slime mold, I don't mind. But what I want to acknowledge is that tools are technique, and the problem that certain tool became part of a certain industry. And the industry is the problem. It's not the tool in itself, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I just want that they pay taxes too.
I think we have touched several aspects, many aspects, both your way of thinking is, and I think we could discuss it for hours more and find new aspects and different aspects. But I would like to give you in the audience the chance to also ask some questions to Claudia and or Anna. And I would give the floor to anybody who's interested, and Julia is going to hand over the microphone. It would be nice if you could shortly introduce yourself so that we all know who you are. Thank you.
First of all, I want to say it was very exciting, very interesting, your both presentations, and it gave me a lot to think about. But a very more or less pragmatic question to you, Anna. I know you actually, when you started this school project, you presented, and followed with great interest. I thought at that time, and still is, it was one of a kind. And I would like to know, this school, with all what you explained and the importance, does it become maybe a role model for this region? You work together, this was one of your aims really, with people around, with material from the region. Are there more by their initiative and a bit supported by you?
Yes, luckily there are following projects. Like I did 5 projects there, so in 2 periods. And also trained students from Bangladesh, and then I went out, I drove back. I tried not to, then there was a request for eco-resort, for example, and then I said, well, I would propose a Bangladeshi colleague, which is Marina Tamasun, who is also now famous. She just won the Aga Khan Award, really an excellent architect, and because I didn't want that, there's any kind of labeling on mud. And there are really great architects in Bangladesh that are working with this material now. Also communities that started doing the community center. And especially, I think for the architects, what they told me is that it opened a new window, it gave a new perspective, because first they saw mud only, as a kind of intermediate stage in the development process. So if you can't afford anything else, take the mud, but it's not the aim to build with mud. The moment you have money in your hands, you go to different materials. And the fact that it is an equal material to brick, to concrete, that was something really new and something that they understood. We did a workshop also there for 70 architects together with Martin Rauch, and there was an enormous interest. And I think, of course, I'm impatient. I would like to have it much more growing and faster growing, but there is something coming on, and I was visiting last spring there, and I saw quite a number of really nice projects coming up now.
Any more questions from the audience? If not, we do have a break now.
I have one
You
more
have.
I have one more question to Claudia. Did you, taking the same question Christine just asked to Anna, do you experience any difficulties when researching or going into the project that they see you as a... Does being a woman create a problem, or does it not, from your perspective?
Well, I've always been a woman, so I struggle. Because it's always been me. But, well, of course, there are things that happen, and of course, there are issues. I've been reading in the past books that compare feminism to ecology because of the idea of weakness and the idea of Gianni Vattimo and the fact that ecology is not iconic, and that's probably the reason why I say I don't like skyscraper, right? In terms of aesthetics. So, in that there might be something interesting. I don't know, it's not my field of research, so I cannot say so much, but she was talking about this idea of harmony, and for me, I try always to conceptualize things. I try to reconceptualize it as this idea of weakness and collective intelligence and distributed system. So to connect the idea, as she said, of try to harmonize and try to read what is out there that does similar, and this is also part of a movement and there's a research. And it's probably true that is maybe a little bit of a female attitude, I don't know. But for me it becomes interesting, how do you promote weak system? Especially in architecture that tend to be very iconic or very recognizing of the figures and etc. No? And it might be female, it might be not. There are also men that have this sensibility. Again, the boundaries are sometimes not so clear. But for me, it's the most, how can you promote the weakness and distributed? Also in the way you do research, no? You need to have this clear research question. And if we want to make a joke or talk about an occasion, I always find myself with this people that look at me with a question mark on the face, because usually when I start a research question, I say 350 questions and not a single one. And no, we need a clear research question. Say, why needs to be clear? Why needs to be one? Cannot be an ecology of idea, or can we discuss this? And of course, then I build my argument and etc. But I noticed this subtle difference, apart from, accident and other elements. And I think, I don't know if it's female or not, somebody claim has got a relationship with female, this idea of ecology and weakness, but for me this is an idea that is worth exploring, how we can be brought forward and how we can have an agency.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you for coming and for participating in this, in our symposium. We now have a break until 12:15. There's going to be a bit of food and, of course, drinks outside. And see you back at 12:15. Thank you.